welcome to another video, Purple Political Talk here, and in today's video, we're going to be taking a look at the latest update in the 2020 presidential electoral map, and taking a look what will happen during this presidential election, which is now less than 2 weeks away, and the next couple of days are crucial when it comes to Americans deciding who their next president will be. So we're going to take a look at fill in the map and talk about each individual state and how the race is shaping up in those states. But before we get started, please remember to like, subscribe, and turn on post notifications to be up to date with our latest content. So let's get started. At this point in time, the Democrats have a very big advantage nationwide with over 10% lead in the national polling data. And of course, polls are something that's rather symbolic, and they're truly not a big factor in my predictions. However, they are indicators, and that kind of would somewhat lead my prediction. But the Democrats are for sure having a very good election season these last couple of days. There is still time for the Republicans to recover. However, there is, to a certain extent, very little things they can do to recover. But the Democrats are heavily favored. Does not mean that it's completely impossible for Donald Trump and his campaign, who currently happen to be behind. So the Democrats, their safe states are pretty safe. That's pretty self-explanatory. And they've been pretty consistent, which states are probably going to go by over 15% for them. But the Republican Party has lost some states that would traditionally vote by safe margins, and now those seats are narrowing down a little bit, but those are only certain instances, which we'll talk about. But as of right now, there is still a very big amount of Republican safe states, of states that would traditionally and probably will continue to vote Republican by safe margins during this election. And of course, we do have states that have narrowed down. And there's many things that are affecting this election on why, for example, Joe Biden is narrowing up the race these last couple of days, why Donald Trump is underperforming past Republicans at the presidential level, especially past incumbents. And for the most part, we're looking at a race where President Donald Trump has too many factors going against him in many different ways. Mostly the COVID-19 pandemic and just his general divisiveness and sort of creation or worsening the polarity in American politics. I think at this point in time, that has been a big issue that a lot of Americans have been thinking about, and the Republicans are behind mostly because of those issues that the Democrats have been able to use against President Donald Trump. All of this in addition to how the Republicans are just simply short of money. However, at this point in time, this is what the current safe electoral map would look like, with all these seats that were filled in by going to the Republicans or the Democrats by more than 15%. Now, during this election, what really matters more, what is the most interesting part of this election, are the battleground states, contested states, that would go anywhere from very narrow, like a couple thousand votes, to a little bit bigger victories of about 10 to 15%. So we're going to take a look at these states and going through by their tiers and talking about each individual state of these states that are crucial to this election, and currently who is leading there and by how much, and what are the influential factors. So right now we're going to start off with the likely states for the Republican Party, or states that they would win, or I project them to win, from anywhere from 5 to 15%. At this point in time, the Republicans have, again, quite a big amount of states that are in the likely column, because they have a lot of states that are currently falling a little bit more into the contested column, where traditionally they would vote a lot more Republican. However, these states, Republican DNA has been there for a very long time, will most likely go and give the victories to President Donald Trump. However, it's going to be slimmer than he did in 2016, and possibly even slimmer than the 2 times President Barack Obama won his elections back in 2012 and 2008. So looking at these states, there's several factors that we're seeing here. In a state like Alaska, we're seeing a lot of independents coming out for Joe Biden of the third-party movement, which is pretty big in the state of Alaska, and that's bringing down Donald Trump's margins by a little bit. That's the first thing to consider. And there's other factors. For example, in the state of Missouri and South Carolina, we're seeing a lot of voters that are African-American, a lot of those minority voters as well, some of the suburban voters of these more conservative American cities that are coming through and voting for Democrats. They're considering change on who they support, and we're seeing high African-American turnout in areas like Missouri, like St. Louis or Kansas City, and in South Carolina, in the big, we could say, blue wall in the state, we're seeing increased turnout amongst African Americans, which is definitely helping out the Republicans, generally speaking. And taking a look at states like Montana and Kansas, these two states are pretty similar in a way that most of their state is not that diverse ethnically, and racially diverse as well. It's not. And here we're just seeing a lot of more independent or moderate Republicans flipping their votes, casting their ballots for Joe Biden. And at this point in time, that's what we're seeing in these states. Overall, a lot of the states that were solidly Republican, and generally speaking, during this election, most trends of the country will be going from, it's going to be trending blue from 2016. We must analyze that, and that's going to be a fact. So after discussing this likely states for the Republican Party, of states that they would win by 5 to 15%, the Republican Party is up to 125 electoral votes. At this point in time, the Democrats still do have an advantage without even counting their likely states. So what are the Democratic likely states? At this point, states that the Democrats should be able to win by over 5%, up to the cutoff point of 15. Right now, the Democrats have a pretty long list of these states, from states like Colorado to Virginia to, at this point, even states like Minnesota and New Hampshire. We're seeing the Democrats perform very well, and even in very crucial parts of this election, deciding tipping points for this election that could even put the Democrats over the edge, we are close to, or are at a point, that the Democrats might be able to win the Rust Belt by over a 5% margin. This would be a very big swing, and right now, there is one state that the Democrats probably are winning by over 5%, and that is the state of Wisconsin. So, generally speaking, on this map, we're seeing some things that are very interesting. One, the Democrats have their states from 2016 down. These are all states that Donald Trump won narrowly in some cases, in the case of Wisconsin, but the rest of the states that we have filled in went to Hillary Clinton by more narrow margins. However, the Democrats and Joe Biden and his team is starting to bring those margins of victory up. So, currently, we have states like Colorado and Virginia that rely heavily on the suburban vote, and truly the suburban vote in those states is what decides elections. In Colorado, that suburban vote has for a long time been more Democratic, and even throughout the last 12 to 16 years, we're seeing very strong numbers for Democrats in the state of Colorado. However, in Virginia, it's taking a little bit more time. But however, that big shift of the suburbs turning for the Democrats, we have seen before our eyes over the last couple of years, and again, they're coming out for Joe Biden. Now, President Donald Trump probably could have contested the state of Virginia. That would have been wasting his resources, so that's probably why he stopped. But generally, those two states are pretty safe Democratic, and especially since there's a lot of college-educated voters in Virginia, and generally a lot of progressive voters in the state of Colorado, where if all of the Bernie Sanders supporters went out and supported Hillary Clinton in 2016, Colorado could have been by a bigger margin, and I think since those voters now have something to complain about in a way, something they're advocating for, they're going to be more pushed to vote. And if that ends up being the case, these, especially in Colorado and even in some extent Virginia, we're going to see those voters vote heavily for Joe Biden. Going on to the state of New Hampshire. The state of New Hampshire is a state that is very politically awkward in a way because it has, first of all, the demographics, generally speaking, like the type of voters that live there, like suburban, urban voters. It's pretty much made up of a couple of smaller, big towns or smaller cities, in addition to a lot of like small, very small towns spread around the state. These voters in New Hampshire vote pretty much like suburban voters. They're pretty split down the middle. And even in like a little bit more of the bigger areas, we still see support for the Democrats or for the Republicans. And it's a state that has been trending a lot more Democratic over the last couple of years. And truly, that trend is not going to stop. Hillary Clinton won here very, very narrowly, and even at a run-on where it was the closest state in 2016. I think Joe Biden is going to win here again with the data we do have, and generally speaking, those types of voters are trending towards the Democratic Party in the state of New Hampshire. Now, going on to the two likely states that fall in the Rust Belt in the industrial Midwest, these two states were expected to be a lot closer during this election when we started first getting the data for this election, when we started taking a look at how the electoral map might have looked like. However, after the pandemic, after the Black Lives Matter movement, which really has impacted this election more in many ways, we're seeing these states, especially Minnesota and Wisconsin, trend a lot more Democratic. In the state of Wisconsin, the Trump campaign has really stopped campaigning there. They're not sending too much support there monetarily and just general in-person campaigning. While in the state of Minnesota, the Republicans pretty much gave up in the state. Donald Trump had a rally there a couple days ago. However, generally speaking, these two states are, in general polling data for the last couple of days, generally over 7%. Very strong numbers for former Vice President Biden. And at this point, it could show us that the Democrats might be in for a victory in those states. So now that we took a look at the likely states on both sides of the aisle, why don't we take a look at the lean states of this election, or states that would go to one party or another by a margin of 1.5% to 5%. At this point in time, let's start off with the Democrats. They have a lot of these states because, generally speaking, they're performing very well. And it's a lot of these swing states that tend to be a little bit more conservative, a lot tighter, that they're performing very, very well in. So, right now, these are the states that would fall under lean margins. And we have states that would fall from a little bit more of the upper lean margin, we could say, so from anywhere from like 4 to 5%, like Nevada, to states, or even the rest, Michigan and Pennsylvania, to states that would probably fall by the lesser lean margin, like Florida and North Carolina, that could fall by 2% or something like that. So these states all have different factors, but one thing we could say definitely is a lot of these states that are currently lean Democratic, one, they're voting a lot off of the economy. The economy post-COVID-19 in these states has really affected a lot of voters, and that is a very big issue for them. And in states like Florida, where COVID-19 rose for most of the summer and the effects economically are being felt, or in places like Michigan and Pennsylvania, where small business owners had to endure a lot of the effects of lockdown, and even to this day, they're still very, very affected by the lockdowns caused by their Democratic governors. We're seeing in these states the Democrats surge in some aspects. In polling data, we have in Nevada from 5% to the Democrats. In Arizona, a state that went very solidly for the Republicans a couple election years ago. Again, 4% for the Democrats. Florida, a state that traditionally has been very close if you look at the data. Right now it has over 3% margin of victory for Joe Biden. North Carolina, pretty similar idea, 3%. And in the Rust Belt, in Pennsylvania and Michigan, we have margins ranging from 4 all the way to 7%. Now, if we base it all off of data, we wouldn't have to do any work in analyzing this. And that is why this election is not only based on the data that we have, especially through polling data. So, generally speaking, a lot of these races, especially like Nevada, Arizona, North Carolina, and Florida, those are not as big of the shockers about how big they're going to be. I mean, Florida and North Carolina maybe, but Nevada and Arizona have always expected to be going by lean margins. In Michigan and Pennsylvania, we're seeing just recently Biden surge by a large margin, and that is something that we're definitely seeing clearly. So overall, I think the Democrats have a very strong hold in their lean states, and overall, it's a category they have a pretty big solid hold of. And this already puts them over the edge, over the 270 electoral votes needed to win the presidency, and it's something that's very important, as they're not going to have to put a lot of things into it, and truly, it's not going to be as hard for them to win the election. So, now that we talked about the Democratic lean states, let's talk about the Republican lean states, or in other words, states that the Republicans will win by 1.5 to 5%. At this point in time, I would say all the states that are left on this map, except the 2 congressional districts, will fall for the Republicans by a margin of 1.5 to 5%. In states like Texas, we're seeing the Democrats heavily overperform expectations. They're gaining a very big amount of the vote in a state that voted by over 7% for President Donald Trump in 2016. And we're seeing very strong numbers for President Donald Trump there. And we're seeing him gain support. Same thing in Georgia. Among suburban voters in Georgia, we're seeing it's somewhat of an exodus from the Republican Party, from the Trump Republican Party. And those voters are also turning former Vice President Biden. Ohio, again, a lot of the African American vote from Cleveland, generally speaking, that general area of the state, and even Cincinnati and Columbus are starting to come out for Biden. In addition to that, we're seeing a lot of manufacturing votes, blue collar workers also turning out for Joe Biden. Same thing in the state of Iowa, where you have a lot of those suburban and more rural voters, as well as some of the blue collar workers that we're seeing turn out for Biden, compared how they turned out to Hillary Clinton in 2016. However, one thing we're seeing is that the base for the Republicans has stayed, and they're staying strong. And generally speaking, the Republicans have very, very solid DNA here. General polling data, they're ahead in most of these states, if not tied with Vice President Joe Biden. However, come election day, I think all these 4 states are going to be under 3% for the Republicans. However, it's still a victory, and I think generally, if some of these states are definitely like on the curve of going into the tilt margin, which we're going to talk about in just a couple of minutes. And right now, I think that these states are very crucial for the Republicans. They did not win these states. Any absolute chance they had of the presidency, absolutely gone. And that's something to keep in mind. So now that we talked about the lean states on both sides, let's talk about the tilt states, or the states that would go by less than 1.5%. And truly, these are not states, but rather congressional districts. Right now, I would say that Maine's 2nd congressional district is going by a tilt margin, while Nebraska's 2nd congressional district is going by a tilt margin. Again, these are very strong characterizations for the Democrats, as these are 2 usually conservative districts. And these districts usually vote for a Democrat if and only when there is a very interesting candidate, or they just really don't like the incumbent. Generally speaking, from the couple of data polls that we do have from these states, it's been very narrow. And at this point in time, Nebraska probably has a bigger chance of going to Biden than Maine. However, things could definitely change. And overall, that doesn't really impact the election in many ways. However, it's something that's rather symbolic, as winning those states, especially for a Democrat, it's a very good look. So overall, this is our electoral map as of October 19th, 2020, where former Vice President Joe Biden is expected to win the presidency, 334 electoral votes to Donald Trump's 204. So guys, I hope you enjoyed the video and you found it very informative. If so, please give it a huge thumbs up, like, subscribe, and turn on post notifications to be up to date with our latest content. Hope you enjoyed the video, and goodbye.